بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Let me just share my slides. طيب, abdominal trauma. Well, just to declare, I'm an adult surgeon. This talk honestly made me go through the whole pediatric surgery books and reviewing abdominal trauma, which I found there is a lot of similarities, but peds and pediatric trauma has very special circumstances and has very special situations which we should all be aware of when we deal with trauma in peds. My talk will be a little bit of introduction. I included the differences mainly between peds and adults in anatomy and physiology, and then I brushed a little bit of assessment and resuscitation as I was told. There is, I think, a talk about resuscitation and pediatric trauma. And then I talk about laparoscopy and a bit of touch on specific organ injuries. And then I'll conclude with damage control laparotomy and abdominal compartment syndrome. Is this interactive or just like one way? Can I ask, or at least like somebody volunteer?
Whichever you prefer, Doc.
Okay, so a small case, just to make it a bit of interactive. 4-year-old girl was hit by her father's car while he was backing out of the garage. She presented to the emergency department, crying, agitated, and her vital signs were heart rate 137, blood pressure 80 over 50, and oxygen saturation 90%. Anybody wants to volunteer? Just how would you guys approach her initially? I don't know if you guys can allow.
هو طبعا زي ما حضرتك عارف دكتور, we will try to facilitate the chat.
So as you guys mentioned in the chat, ATLS protocol, and this is exactly what you should do. You should not go with the obvious things or the distracting injuries, like for example, somebody with mangled leg or somebody who's like actively bleeding. You should always go with the ATLS protocol, which stays ABCs, airway, breathing, and circulation, and then you take it from there. So I always encourage my resident and my student to start with the ABCs. You don't go with the obvious, you go with the logic, which is airway, breathing, and circulation. So according to the American Academy of Pediatric age distribution for childhood is as the following: infants birth to 2 years, childhood 2 to 12 years, and adolescent 12 to 21 years. I think this is like very obvious for you guys as pediatric surgeon, but for me as adult surgeons, I had to review it and I came up with this. And interesting enough, I found that in Saudi Arabia, we consider pediatric age group up to 14 years. So it's kind of between the childhood and adolescent. I didn't find like any scientific background for this cutoff, but usually any child below age of 14, they usually dealt with by pediatric surgeon. Beyond 14 years old, they get dealt with by adult surgery. Blunt abdominal trauma is the most common or more common than penetrating, which is very fortunate for pediatric, because managing blunt abdominal trauma in non-operative way is more effective. Usually we do less trauma laparotomies for blunt traumas, while penetrating, most of the time they might need to go to OR. Falls, as you might know, is the most common mechanism. Car accident, especially as you grow or as the age group goes up, become more common, and unfortunately it's more lethal. And I'm sure all of you guys as resident, all of you seen car accident, and you guys dealt with pediatric age group trauma. In 2010, the number of RTAs per 100,000 population was 11.4, and this was like 11 years ago, and I'm sure nowadays is way more than that. So how is pediatric are different from adults? And again, as I said, I'm an adult surgeon, and I had to go through my anatomy books and pediatric books to differentiate, especially in which is related to abdominal trauma. I'm not going through the airway or their breathing. I'll just go through quickly for their general trauma perspective or abdominal trauma in particular. So solid organs compared to the adult, larger, and they are less protected. In adult, the spleen is way high up below the crib cage, while in pediatric age group, it's kind of lower, and it's not as protected. So it's more prone for injury, even with minor injuries, which is usually not well protected, which is usually in adult can be avoided. The same goes for the spleen. They're compact, so they have a smaller body surface area and a smaller diameter, anterior posterior diameter. So the impact of an injury has a major effect or has more effect than the same force if applied to pediatric group has more effect than if it was applied for an adult or adolescent age group. They have less fat and their their abdominal muscles are weaker, so they cannot cushion or they cannot protect the intra-abdominal muscles as an adult or adolescents. As you go younger or infant age group or toddlers, they cannot express their pain, they cannot express their tenderness except by crying, which is very difficult to be assessed. When it comes to physiology, their normal heart rate and respiratory rate are higher than adults, and I'm sure you guys are all aware of this, but it is lower in the blood pressure perspective. Tachycardia and poor skin perfusion are first signs of shock compared to adults where they don't develop or we don't rely a lot on skin perfusion, and the heart rate might not be of benefit, especially for elderly who are usually or sometimes on medication which might affect the heart rate. Their normal heart rate is calculated as 70 plus 2 times their age in years. Their diastolic blood pressure is about 2/3 of their systolic. And finally, they are more prone for hypothermia and insensible fluid loss, as I mentioned before, because they have larger body surface area and they can lose their temperature quickly. Interesting enough, the pediatric, they have a good reserve, physiological reserve, but if they went into shock, it will be very difficult to regain them. So you'll find them like going on a plateau, and all of a sudden you find them declining very quickly. So if you had a kid with a normal blood pressure, but he lost a lot of blood, you have to replace it quickly. And I'll talk about this in a few minutes, because if they lost their physiological reserve, they go into irreversible shock. This is more or less similar to the adult hemorrhagic shock classes. If you lost up to 15 to 30, 30 to 40, and more than 40. And as of you guys all know, usually the blood volume is around 80 to 90 ml per kilogram. So you have to calculate it based on their weight. Another way or quick way, which is a partial pediatric emergency tape, which I encourage all the residents to have when they deal with pediatric trauma. It gives you a quick measurement or a quick idea about the patient weight, the common drug doses, and the vital signs normal values in this pediatric tape. So this is in brief their differences. So when you face a trauma patient, especially if you are resuscitating somebody with a suspected abdominal trauma, we always go A, B, C. As I said before, we don't go with the obvious. We don't go with the distracting injury. We go with ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation, especially if you are dealing with the kid alone or you don't have a lot of manpower around you. So if you are the primary care physician, you go with airway, breathing, circulation. Then, as you might all know, they have more difficult vascular access, and this is where interosseous access comes. Usually, interosseous can be used anywhere. It's very safe. It's very easy, and there is a lot of devices friendly user, and it can be used from like infant age group to pre-puberty age group with a very low complications and risk of injuries, iatrogenic injuries, I mean. Usually, when you resuscitate pediatric, you have to give them 3 times your expected volume loss of crystalloid to restore their physiological intravascular volume. So if a kid lost around 10 cc, you have to give 30 cc of steroid to gain their physiological values or normal values. Usually as a bolus, we start with 20 ml per kilogram, and followed, if it didn't work out or their heart rate and urine output and their volume, you did not expect or you don't expect that it is coming back to normal, you have to start blood. And nowadays, early blood transfusion proven to be more efficient, less morbid, and less mortality. So no harm to start blood early if you think your kid is on second or third class of shock. Ringer lactate and blood should not be given through the same line for clotting. So the recommendation is usually have them through different lines, or you stop the IV fluid or the ringer lactate when you start the blood. And again, no harm of starting massive transfusion protocol early on, and start 1-to-1-to-1 transfusion, which is 1 unit of blood versus 1 unit of platelet and versus 1 unit of fresh frozen plasma, calculated to their suitable blood volume, suitable to their blood volume, compared to start it early on. Controlled hypotension is a theory usually we use in adult, which usually we keep their systolic blood pressure on the lower edge, especially if we suspect bleeding. But in pediatric age group, because they have so common associated traumatic brain injury or head injury, it's not that recommended through pediatric literature. So trying to get them to their normal blood pressure is way better than keeping them on the lower edge, because this will have an adverse effect on the brain injury if they have associated traumatic brain injury. So again, in order to save your kid, you have to transfuse them and try to resuscitate them to return to their normal parameters, rather than keeping them on the hypotensive side. So this is from resuscitation and differences point of view. Now I'll be moving to their investigation. So if we have a kid, we resuscitated, they are kind of stable, whether we go for CT or no. American Pediatric Surgery Association recommended indication, or they stated indications for CT scan. So if you have any history suggestive of intra-abdominal trauma, definitely you'll go for CT. If your physical examination is suggestive of trauma to the abdomen, you request CT, which I mean bruises, seatbelt sign, tenderness, ecchymosis. All these are indications. If you did a FAST study, it was positive, you go for CT. Although FAST wasn't that popular in pediatric, because it doesn't have high yield in pediatric age group compared to the adult. In adult, usually we rely very well on FAST, especially if it was done by expert. But in pediatric age group, I didn't find a lot of evidence supporting doing FAST. Yes, we do it, but it's not that highly yield compared to the CT scan. But anyway, if you get a positive FAST, you should go for CT scan. If you have associated thoracic trauma, and I know Dr. Mishal is giving a talk about thoracic trauma after me. If you have associated thoracic trauma, definitely you want to rule out abdominal trauma. If you have elevated liver enzyme, this is a great indication that the kid might have associated liver injury. In adults, we don't rely usually on liver enzymes. Adult group might have liver injury and still they have normal LFTs, while in pediatric, it is quite sensitive, maybe not specific, but quite sensitive for trauma. The same applies for pancreatic enzymes, lipase or amylase. So if you have it elevated at initial investigation, you should go for CT scan. To rule out urological or kidney injuries, if you have gross hematuria, microscopic hematuria, you go for CT scan. If you have hematocrit repeated on 2 consecutive readings and it was decreasing, you should rule out abdominal trauma by doing CT scan. Do you guys see my slides? Somebody is saying it's not moving.
Yeah, we can see the slides, Doctor, but the previous slide just took a little bit of lag, and now everything is going smoothly.
Okay. Like guys, if anything, just Abdulkader, if you can't speak up, because I'm closing the chat, okay?
Absolutely.
Is it moving?
Yes, Doctor.
So there was an article published in Journal of Pediatric Surgery where they implemented this protocol for CT scan. Because, you know, like in adult, we have a very low threshold to do CT scan. In pediatric, the risk of radiation and associated malignancies make us a little bit more reluctant to do CT scan. So in Journal of Pediatric Surgery, this article was published, and the article concluded if when they followed up this algorithm, they decreased the need for CT scan from 17.5% to 8%. So almost like half the CTs were not done, and they did not miss any injury in follow-up. Still, like in our population or in our community, I think it's not fully applicable, but we can consider doing a similar organism in here, and we can evaluate it. Next thing I'll talk about is laparoscopy. Laparoscopy, as you guys know, it's a new modality. It's not that new, but it's a new modality coming in the field. A lot of trauma surgeons, adult trauma surgeons are using it more and more for exploration, and it's proven in expert hand to decrease the need for unnecessarily laparotomy. And in adult, it is the gold standard for diaphragmatic injury, to rule out diaphragmatic injury. So there was a couple of articles I found in pediatric trauma and rule of laparoscopic surgery. And they all concluded that it is safe. It is coming into the field. They encouraged surgeons to use it, but you have to be expert, and you have to select the patient you are using or you are applying the laparoscopy on very carefully. They cannot be unstable patient. So any unstable patient should go for direct to laparotomy. And you have to be expert in running the bowel to rule out bowel injury. You have to be expert in using the laparoscope to examine the retroperitoneum and different part of the abdomen. Again, it's not well established. It's not the recommendation in trauma literature to start with laparoscopy, but I'm sure over the next few years it might be one of the recommendations. So laparotomy, which is we all done as a surgeon in a trauma, you have some indication which you go directly from ER to OR. If you have unstable patient with evidence of abdominal trauma, either by history or physical examination or by FAST, you should take them directly. In pediatric age group, the instability can be due to hypovolemic shock as well as head injury. So the head injury almost equivalent or have major effect on the vitals as pediatric. So if you have unstable patient and you ruled out head injury, you should go for laparotomy. Any signs of peritonitis, you take the patient directly for laparotomy without any further investigation. If the patient did not respond to resuscitation and transfusion, this is an indication for laparotomy to rule out intra-abdominal bleeding. If you have penetrating injury or blunt injury with intra-abdominal organs evacuation, another indication. Evidence of pneumoperitoneum by CT scan, X-rays are indication for laparotomy. If the patient had penetrating injury and on presentation he was vomiting blood, or you found evidence of blood on digital rectal examination, this is an indication for laparotomy because it indicates that there is a bowel or gastric injury. And if you found by chest X-ray or CT scan evidence of diaphragmatic rupture, again you should take the patient directly for laparotomy. I'll talk next on solid organ injuries, which is mainly kidney, liver, spleen, and kidneys. I'll talk about their operative versus non-operative management, and where we should admit them, how frequent we should do their hemoglobin, and whether we should do angioembolization, whether therapeutic or prophylaxis, and the risk of secondary bleeding, and which patient we should expect that might fail the non-operative bleeding, and when is appropriate time for their discharge, and if we need to do follow-up images. And last point in the solid organ injury, I'll talk about tranexamic acid and anticoagulation in the pediatric age group. So as you know, or I mentioned before, most of the blunt injury are associated with solid organ injuries. Small bowel or large bowel usually don't get injured easily in pediatric age group. There was a lot of talk and recommendation in the literature. I read through the American Pediatric Surgery Association guidelines in management of solid organ injury, and they didn't find a lot of solid evidence or RCTs to base their recommendation on, but it was mostly recommendation based on some retrospective literature. So if you have a kid with spleen or liver injury, usually or before it was the grade plus 1 day. You keep the patient. So if you have a grade 2 injury, you admit the patient for 2 days plus 1, so 3 days. It's been doubted a lot, and a lot of literature says the length of stay doesn't have to be that long. A lot of kids are being discharged safely home in less than that. If you want to be very safe, you can follow up this rule, but there is no evidence, or there is no much evidence to support that. So if you have like grade 2, you can keep them for 1 day and you let them go home. For ICU admission, usually the higher the grade, the more ICU need. The more ICU is needed for observation. And again, it's not that solid basis for this, except that it was for recommendation. So if you have the ICU for grade 4, 5, well and good. If you don't have it, you can keep the patient on a monitored bed. If you are nearby a facility, or you have a facility to operate on the patient once needed. How frequent we should do hemoglobin for those patients? Again, there was no much evidence to do it, whether you do it every 6 hours or every 8 hours or every 12 hours, but mostly the recommendation was based on retrospective studies. 6 to 8 hours was reasonable, but the patient who have decline or they have admission hematocrit of 35 or less, they were more of a need for transfusion. So those patients were in more danger of failing the non-operative management, and they were more critical, and they were more of transfusion. So if you have a kid and you did the CBC on them on admission and their hematocrit was less than 35, those patients you might want to do hemoglobin every 6 hours. And those patients you might want to admit them to ICU and keep them. And those patients you might want to start transfusion early. And you keep in mind you might need to take them to OR early on as well. Prophylactic angioembolization in adults, there is good evidence that if you have active splash on CT scan, I mean arterial splash, you go for angioembolization prophylactically. But in pediatric, actually, they did not recommend to do prophylactic angioembolization. If you have unstable patient or transient responder with active extravasation, yes, you go for angioembolization. But for somebody who you found active extravasation on CT scan, but the patient was stable, you don't need to do prophylactic angioembolization. Again, so if you have unstable patient or transient responder patient with active extravasation on CT scan, you go for angio. But for stable patient, even if they have active extravasation on CT, angioembolization is not indicated. This is a major difference between adult and pediatric age group. So when they can go to play, I'm sure you guys are all aware of this rule, which is the injury grade plus 2 weeks. Again, there was no evidence supporting that. They recommended to do that safely. But again, if you send your kid to play in a shorter period of time, especially in grade 1 or grade 2. It's again safe to do that. Do you need to do, usually the injury grade plus 2 weeks is the safe time to or safe recommendation, but again, it wasn't proven on a solid basis. It's just recommendation. If you send your kid back to his normal activity before that, it will be okay, especially for low grade injury. For repeating our routine, repeating the images, whether ultrasound or CT scan, there was no evidence supporting routine repeating images. If you have asymptomatic patient, i.e. no pain, no abdominal distension, no jaundice, nothing, you don't need to repeat the CT scan, or you don't need to repeat the ultrasound for the kid after 4 or 6 weeks. You just send them out with no even follow-up. If there is any evidence of complication like AV fistula, jaundice, pseudocyst, aneurysm, then you might want to repeat the CT scan, but there was no recommendation supporting routine repeat of CT scan. Okay, is the slides going fine, guys?
Yeah, should I repeat the CT scan? Is going fine, doc.
Okay. Discharge instruction was applied by institution. I didn't write, but it's like multi-state institutions. They were giving the discharge instructions to the families, and they follow it up. I found it, and I think, I don't know if we use this in Saudi, but I think it's a good discharge instruction for patients with blunt abdominal trauma. Okay, so you have a patient, you decided to treat their liver injury or their spleen injury non-operatively, and you should think always that your non-operative management might fail. What the predictors? So if you have higher injury severity scale, definitely they have higher chance of failing non-operative management. If you have associated head injury, this was found to be associated with failure of non-operative management. Definitely if you have higher organ injury grade, and if you have multiple organs injured like spleen and kidney on the same side, or liver and kidney on the same side, this is a risk factor for failure of non-operative management. Age was found is not associated, like it's not like if you are older, your chances of failing non-operative management is higher. It's not like adults. Adults, the age was associated with failure, but in pediatric, age wasn't associated with non-operative management failure. If the non-operative management will fail, usually it fails in the first 12 hours post-injury. i.e. between it range between 2 and 48 hours. I found different literature says in the first 6 hours or first 12 hours, and the range was maximum 48 hours. Very rare that non-operative management fails beyond that period. So if you pass your first 24 hours with no surgery, I think the chances of having this kid out of the hospital without surgery is very high. Usually, and this is very interesting, if the pediatric kid was dealt with in non-pediatric hospital, they have 5 times higher chance that the non-operative management fails, because the adult surgeon, usually they don't have a lot of experience with the pediatric, so they have a lower threshold to take them to the operating room. They have less experience in examining them. So there was literature published recently, actually in 2019, saying if the kid was looked after by in a non-pediatric hospital, they have 5 times more chance to be operated on unnecessarily. Again, if the kid was looked after by general surgeon rather than pediatric surgeon, they have higher chance of having unnecessarily surgery. This is why my personal recommendation, and I'm sure a lot of pediatric surgeon agrees with me, that pediatric trauma should dealt with by skilled pediatric surgeon. Last thing I'll talk about in the solid organ injury, the tranexamic acid and the anticoagulation. Again, I was impressed with the amount of literature I found in pediatric trauma, in pediatric surgery literature about the anticoagulation and tranexamic acid. So it is not recommended for pre-puberty children if I mean the VTE prophylaxis or the enoxaparin or low molecular weight heparin or unfractionated heparin. If the kid at the pre-puberty age, they don't need DVT prophylaxis. For high-risk patients, i.e. age more than 13 or ISS more than 25, it is recommended that to start DVT prophylaxis unless there is contraindication for heparin, i.e. bleeding or anything else. If you have to reduce the risk, it is found early mobilization, avoiding central venous catheterization will help reduce the risk for DVTs. And there was a strong recommendation against screening routinely for DVT in pediatric age group. For tranexamic acid, contradicting to the adult literature, did not affect morbidity or mortality of the injured children, especially the younger age group. When they are beyond 15, yes, they might have benefit, but before that, there was no difference in morbidity or mortality. If it would be used, was used on a different regimen. The regimen which they recommended to use if you have more than 15 age or 15 years old injured kid, you would use 15 milligram per kilogram, followed by 2 milligram per kilogram per hour over 8 hours for 24 hours, and you should stop it after that. And this was level 3 evidence. This was the part for solid organ injuries. My next topic will be about the damage control laparotomy. It was first described in 1983, so it's fairly around like 40 years old, the damage control laparotomy, and it gained so much popularity, especially over the last 20 years. Initially, it was described for a bleeding patient who they could not stop his bleeding, and he went into coagulopathy and he was hypothermic, so they had to pack him and send him to ICU. And they found out after 24 hours, patient did very well, and they returned him back to the operating room, and they did small bowel resection and anastomosis, I think. So it goes through 4 phases. Phase 0, which is the pre-surgery damage control resuscitation, which is usually the stage in the emergency department, where you try to load your patient with blood products. You try to optimize their physiological status in preparation to take them to the operating room. In the operating room, you do pre-surgery, completely fast and the minimum. You don't want to do complicated hepatic resection. You don't want to do complicated anastomosis. You just want to stop the bleeding, to control the contamination, and that's it. Phase 2, which is usually done in the intensive care unit, and this takes 24 to 48 hours, where we resuscitate the patient. We try to put them back on track from a physiological point of view. And after 48 hours or 72 hours, the patient will go back to the operating room for definitive repair and reconstruction. And phase 4, either it is done with phase 3, or sometimes we delay it another 48 hours or 72 hours, where we close the abdomen to avoid compartment syndrome. So indication, usually if you have your patient on severe physiological derangement, which i.e. lethal triad, hypothermia, coagulopathy, and acidosis, this is an absolute indication where you should not do complicated laparotomy of the patient. If you are unable to control bleeding, whether it is venous, you just do backing, or if it is arterial, sometimes we do backing and send the patient to angioembolization. So you try to do your best in the operating room, but always remember, if you cannot control it from outside, the radiologist, especially if you have very skilled radiologists, can control it from inside. Large volume resuscitation, if the patient receive large volume of blood and blood products or IV fluid, this is an indication for damage control procedure, and to avoid abdominal compartment. If you have combined pancreaticoduodenal injury, especially if you have major pancreatic duct injury or major duodenal injury, you don't want to do Whipple on the same sitting. So you control the bleeding, you control the contamination, you send the patient to ICU, and you can do Whipple after 48 hours where the condition is more favorable. If you have a major liver injury, as I said, to control the bleeding, if you need stage abdominal or thoracic wall reconstruction, if you have a major loss on the chest or the abdomen, especially if in the explosion or penetrating injuries. If you have major vascular injury with the gross bowel contamination, this is an indication to do damage control procedure, because you don't want to apply a graft or do a complicated vascular reconstruction where you have bowel contents in the field. Okay. Last thing will be abdominal compartment syndrome. Few definitions: intra-abdominal pressure, which is the pressure concealed within the abdominal cavity. Abdominal perfusion pressure, which is usually the MAP minus the intra-abdominal pressure. Intra-abdominal hypertension, which is defined as physiological pathological elevation of intra-abdominal pressure, and abdominal compartment syndrome, which is intra-abdominal hypertension plus end organs damage. Again, these definitions has to be well known to all of you guys, because abdominal compartment is one of the diagnoses which is under-diagnosed in the intensive care unit and under-treated by a lot of physicians, because simply they are not aware of the condition. It can be primary, secondary, or tertiary. Primary, which is usually result in intra-abdominal pathology like abdominal trauma or intra-abdominal tumors or anything which is occupy the pelvic abdominal cavity, which increases the intra-abdominal pressure. Secondary, which originate from elsewhere outside the pelvic abdominal cavity and increases the abdominal pressure, the intra-abdominal pressure. And tertiary, which is usually after treating the primary and secondary, still patient might develop. So if you have patient with open abdomen and you apply PAC, still this patient might develop recurrent or tertiary abdominal compartment syndrome. In order to measure the intra-abdominal pressure and say this patient has compartment, you have to have a patient completely sedated, ventilated, and usually we do the measurement at the end of expiration in a complete supine position, and patient should be paralyzed. So you cannot have a patient who's sneezing or coughing or fighting the ventilator and you measure their intra-abdominal pressure, because eventually by default their intra-abdominal pressure will be high, and the transducer should be zeroed at the level of the mid-axillary, I mean at the level of the bed. When we manage abdominal compartment, there is non-surgical management and surgical management. The only evidence for non-surgical management is a trial of neuromuscular blockage, i.e. you paralyze the patient and see if their intra-abdominal pressure or their symptoms might improve. Again, you don't want to over-resuscitate them, but this will eventually go into a third spacing way, which is the abdominal cavity is a major part of that. Sedation might not help a lot. NGT, decompression, rectal tube, again, there was no evidence that these things will help intra-abdominal compartment or intra-abdominal hypertension. Again, the same applies for body positioning and diuretics. If none of these worked, and the patient has intra-abdominal fluid, i.e. blood or ascites, drainage definitely will help. If none of those worked out, surgery is the key, where you have to do bedside decompressive laparotomy. I think I'll stop here, because as I was told, I have 50 minutes, and I think I will just through my 50 minutes exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for this intuitive and instructive lecture.
Well, I gathered all the trauma in 50 minutes. I don't think it was very helpful to a lot of people. Like every topic of those should take at least 2 hours to be discussed. بس ما ادوني الجماعة الorganizers.
Inshallah, next time we will have a further discussion about the issues. And regarding the time, we would like to ask your kindness just to answer a couple of the attendees' question. We will start with the first question of Dr. Mudassir. He's asking, what are the endpoints of resuscitation?
Well, your endpoint of resuscitation, either you take patient to surgery to stop the bleeding if the cause of hypotension or shock is bleeding, or patient die, if I get your question correctly.
Yeah, exactly, doctor. And he's also asking, what is the recommended pressure should be used in laparoscopy in a trauma patient?
What the recommended what?
What is the recommended abdominal pressure which should be used in laparoscopy in a trauma patient?
Well, for adults, we usually use the intra-abdominal pressure around 12 pneumoperitoneum, but in pediatric, I'm not sure, to be honest. But definitely, you don't want to get the anesthesia crazy. So you have to organize with the anesthetist on the other side. If you put too much pressure and patient start to be hypotensive, or patient start to have lower intravenous return, or if they have difficulty ventilating, you should decrease your intra-abdominal pressure. So definitely the intra-abdominal pressure will be dictated by the whole situation of the patient and the anesthetist's ability to ventilate the patient.
Excellent. Another anonymous attendee is asking, doctor, is there still a rule of permissive hypotension in management of active solid organs?
Again, I can't see the questions.
It's below, doctor. He's stating exactly.
Yeah. Just tell me what the question
is. There still a rule of permissive hypotension in management of active solid organ injury?
In management of solid organ injuries, yes, there is. In adults, at least, we use the permissive hypotension for management of those patients, especially if you have like other associated vascular injury.
Excellent. Thank you, doctor. This is about the questions that we're going to answer today. Inshallah, the other questions will be posted through our Twitter account, and hopefully all the questions will be answered. We thank you very much, Dr. Basem, for this intuitive lecture, and we hope we see you again soon.
Okay. Thank you very much.